go. And there we go. And then there we go. There we go. That and that and wait, take a look. I don't know why you have a dead screen. You had a dead screen on that. I don't know why you had that fucking problem. But okay, I'm not gonna fight it. I think I know why, and it's kind of annoying. Fucking annoying. There you go. Thank you. Yeah, like, I keep having trouble. I'm so sorry. I think it's because I'm using this borderless full screen thing so I can alt-tab for Final Fantasy XI, and I think it puts this driver, you know? I think it puts this driver on like, your window, your full screen. And I think if you don't use the driver, it, like, crashes. I'm gonna go test it again, I guess. I'm gonna go test it, but this time around I'm gonna, I just uninstalled it. Never mind. I uninstalled it. I don't care. I'm not gonna fuck with that. I'm not gonna worry about it. Just gonna exit. It was fun to play it for a couple matches, but I'm not gonna keep doing that. You know. Just gonna fish because I know it's not gonna upset anything. It's so annoying. I was having fun too. I wanted a few matches, but of course, the barrier curse is like, nah, black screen, you know? So dumb. No. Oh, you had the wrong fucking title. Oh, really? Fucking so annoying. So annoying. Okay, hold on. I gotta change my fucking title. Oh. Yeah. No. There we go. Okay, I changed it on Twitch, and then I've got to change it on YouTube. Hold on. So annoying. No. Oh, you had the wrong fucking title. There we go. Yeah, but more. Yes, and then show me like a game title thing here. Title and description language. But see, I'm trying to get to the gaming title, which would be Final Fantasy XI. Yep, there we go. I'm just gonna disable all comments. I really don't care. I don't care. I don't care. I don't need people to talk on my fucking YouTube chat. I'm okay with it. They're okay. So there we go. We're like better now. Sorry about that, guys. Like, I don't know what the holdup was there. Like, I wanted to just go do something, play a different game for once. And like, it was like, nah, black screen. And I'm like, man, come on, man. Like, I don't know what your fucking deal is. Like, I shouldn't have uninstalled it. I should try it again, but I also don't want to do anything that crashes my fucking stream. It's not a good look, you know? It's not a good look. Not at all. Well, let's go see what's going on YouTube. Oh, good. There's my titles and stuff. Very good.
Your skill has increased.
Well, that's good. I'm gonna look at my history. What was I looking at last night? It was like... Yeah, that one. There, I want to hear the rest of that.
The decision was taken to move away from the slower-paced, text-based input games that they had become known for developing. After surveying the landscape, it was decided that King's Knight would be developed as a vertical scrolling shooter, quite the deviation from Square's typical games. This particular subgenre had been growing in popularity since the late 1970s, following the release of games like SNK's Ozma Wars. Unlike traditional shoot-em-ups like Space Invaders and Galaxian, this new wave of games featured a moving background that simulated the effect of enemies moving towards the player, and they also featured energy levels to act like health bars. In 1982, Namco's Xevious provided a solid template for what a vertical scrolling shooter should be, proving to be a success in Japanese arcades. That success was then replicated when it launched on the Famicom at the end of 1984, with over 1 million copies sold, and it prompted other developers to take note. By the mid-80s, a decent number of vertical scrolling shooters had been released on the system, and games like 1942 and Twin B had also managed to sell over 1 million copies. But outside of the Super Dimension Fortress Macross, which was developed by Namco and was based on a popular anime series, almost all of the other games released within the genre before July of 1986 had been released in arcades first, before being ported over to the Famicom if they had generated strong enough returns. This approach helped to mitigate some of the risk, but Square didn't have that luxury. They lacked the infrastructure to adopt a similar approach, and they weren't able to work with their licensed property. Instead, they would need to take a calculated risk, and it would see them act as a trailblazer by striving to create one of the first shooters to be exclusive to the Famicom. But they were also keen to try and mitigate risk wherever possible. So, instead of attempting to create something wholly original, Square took inspiration from an innovative game developed by Konami called Nightmare, which had been released towards the start of 1986 on the MSX. Unlike many other shooters that had been released in the preceding years, which focused on space combat or placing the player in a wartime setting, Nightmare deviated by being...
No, it's the program that makes Final Fantasy XI let me alt-tab without crashing it. It's forcing a driver on my desktop that, like, if another full-screen game clashes against it, it, like, black screens on
your inventory is full.
On Streamlabs, I think. I was doing too much. I was, like, doing too much for the drivers to handle it, unfortunately. I dream one day of a Windows that can do it, you know? When you have a huge TV like this, Dave, it's wonderful, but it's also a curse because you have driver errors all the time, because the TV will be, like, running at 90 inches, 2560 by 1440, but you're trying to do something else or something, like you're trying to run some other game. And with the driver that keeps Final Fantasy from crashing when I alt-tab, it crashes like any other game that I run on the desktop. So eventually I'll have to turn off that program when I run on Overwatch. But I think it's kind of annoying because it started, like the program itself is set to start when you log into Windows. So I didn't want to mess with all the settings to fix it. I just moved on. I don't need to play Overwatch 2 very much, you know. I'm not too worried about Overwatch 2, you know. I'm not too worried about it.
Set in ancient Greece, and this
not too worried about Rust.
Meant that its
I don't care. I'm just gonna play whatever I feel like playing. I don't
Instead
care.
of firing laser beams or shooting bullets from guns, would shoot arrows, as well as throwing boomerangs and even swords. Owing to Sakaguchi's fascination with the role-playing genre, it was a logical source of inspiration. But even though their creative talent were keen to tackle this new challenge head-on, Square's hasty decision to move away from developing for personal computers meant they lacked the internal programming talent to create software for the Famicom. It led to them collaborating with a third-party developer called Works, who later became known as Bits Laboratory. Square had worked with them previously, having outsourced the Famicom port of Fexter to the company, but this time, instead of just porting something to a new system, they would work hand-in-hand with the creative team at Square to craft something new. With the development partner secured, Sakaguchi planned out how they could evolve what had been seen with Nightmare, as well as the genre as a whole. It saw role-playing mechanics layered over those typically found within the genre, and it helped to create a new genre that was dubbed the Formation RPG by Square. It meant that in addition to there being the objective of defeating enemies and obstacles that appeared before the player by using projectiles, a leveling system was also introduced, as well as a jump mechanic. The life meter could also be influenced in either a positive or negative manner by in-level pickup. There were hidden dungeons, and 4 hidden elements would need to be found and collected in order to obtain enough power to challenge the game's final boss. The decision was also taken to include not 1 character, but 4, and each had specific traits that helped to distinguish them from one another outside of having a unique design. Rajak was a knight who was given an enhanced basic attack. Kaliva was a wizard who had good jumping abilities. Harusa was a monster with strong defense, and Toby was a thief who had the fastest movement speed. Each also had specific special skills that could be accessed upon finding the 4 hidden elements, and when compared to a standard shooter, it was a lot. Due to the underlying mechanics and its overall complexity, as part of the game's promotional campaign, specific strategy guides even ended up being published to help players figure out what they actually needed to do in order to finish the game, as well as the locations of all the items they needed to find. Nonetheless, the team must have felt confident that the fusion of role-playing elements with the shooter genre would have allowed the game to stand out, especially since the experience proposed would be rather different from what gamers might expect. As development of King's Knight progressed, the business side of Square, which was led by Masafumi Miyamoto and Hisashi Suzuki, and had been supplemented by the hires of individuals such as Yosuke Hirata, attempted to figure out how they could compete against publishers that were more established, had more resources, and had bigger budgets. By mid-1986, 26 different publishers had released games on the Famicom, but almost a third of the software that had been produced had been released by just 5 of them. They were Konami, Namco, Hudson Soft, Bandai, and Capcom. Each had released at least 1 game that had managed to sell more than 1 million copies, and many of them had managed to release multiple million copy sellers. They had achieved this by creating unique experiences, like Tag Team Match Muscle, or by porting over smash hits they had already released on other systems, like Lode Runner and Bomberman. Square no doubt anticipated that each of them would have chosen to support the Famicom disk system in a similar fashion, and that if they did, smaller companies, who didn't have a strong reputation for creating high-quality Famicom or indeed arcade games, would be drowned out. In order to compete, they would need to get creative. At this point, Square was already part of the Super Software team. It had been created in 1985 so that smaller developers who focused on creating software for personal computers could help each other out and assist by releasing ports on complementary systems in order to gain additional revenue. But none of them had any real experience with producing games for the Famicom or the disk system, and the same was also true for figuring out how they could convince consumers to buy their games once they had been created. To try and combat the threat posed by larger publishers, Square chose to take the initiative and proposed the creation of a new publishing arm called the Disc Original Group, or DOG, and it would be responsible for overseeing the creation and publishing of original games for the Famicom disk system. Unlike the SST, which was more of a collective with shared responsibilities and no defined leadership, the Disc Original Group would see Square placed in charge of sales and distribution, and anyone else who joined would be responsible for development only. Because of this, some members of the SST, like Bulletproof Software, chose not to take part and decided to try and tackle these new platforms on their own. But 6 members did still choose to sign up, and the Disc Original Group publishing arm was officially formed on the 14th of July 1986, just 1 week after the release of Alpha. With both of these initiatives in play, Square decided to further consolidate their position in the marketplace, and the most important part of this was for Masafumi Miyamoto to step out of his father's shadow. Up until now, Square had continued to operate as a subdivision of Denusha, the company founded by Masafumi's father, Kuniichi Miyamoto. But on the 4th of September 1986, Square was formed as an independent company, and despite being based heavily in Tokyo, it was supported by a loan of 10 million yen by Shikoku Bank, which was around $45,000 at the time, something that retained the association with Tokushima. When the company was formed in an official sense, 6 directors were appointed. Masafumi and his father took up 2 of the positions, and as a reward for their contributions to the company's success, 2 director positions were given to Hisashi Suzuki and Hironobu Sakaguchi, 2 of Masafumi's first hires. Hiromichi Tanaka was not granted a directorial position at this time, but he was given a full-time contract in recognition for his achievements, and the decision was also taken around this time to bring Nobuo Uematsu into the fold, as up until that point, he had only been a contractor. Born on the 21st of March 1959 in Koichi City, Uematsu didn't display any real interest in music as a child. It was only when his older sister took him to see the Vienna Boys Choir in concert when he was around 10 years old that this all changed. It awakened something inside him that would have a significant impact on not just Uematsu's immediate interests, but also many, many people around the world for decades to come. With this latent interest awakened, over the next few years, in lieu of any formal training, Uematsu started to teach himself how to play the piano. And when he was 12, this expanded to learning the classical guitar, after he found one in his grandfather's house, showed intrigue, and promptly received it as a gift soon after. By consistently practicing, Uematsu became quite proficient, but despite displaying real raw talent, his parents refused to let him study music at university as they didn't see it as a viable career. Frustrated, Uematsu instead studied foreign languages, and so that he could still pursue his interest in music away from the disapproving eyes of his parents, he chose to study at Kanagawa University, which was almost 500 miles away from his home. After graduating, Uematsu decided to stay in Hiyoshi and started to mingle with other aspiring creatives, often while consuming lots of alcohol. There were those who also liked to make music, but others wanted to make movies, draw and write. Together, they would share stories about their struggles to make any real headway in their respective creative fields. Each was so desperate to make it big, but many were snowed under with a ton of irrelevant part-time jobs, and in the case of Uematsu, while attempting to write music, he also worked as a termite exterminator and as an employee in a printing factory. When Uematsu landed the initial role at Square working on Cruise Chaser Blasty, it was the big break he had been looking for. His fortunes had changed, and after impressing with that project, and by also producing high-quality music for Alpha, the decision was taken to retain the talents of Uematsu for future projects such as King's Knight. Upon the game's release, just a few weeks after the company had gone independent, specific praise was dedicated towards the game's music, which had been composed by Uematsu and programmed by Yoshiaki Tsuruoka from Works, and this vindicated the decision to bring Uematsu on board in a full-time capacity. Despite the game's punishing difficulty and complicated setup, King's Knight was well received across the board. Readers of Family Computer magazine scored it as a 19.27 out of 30, and this made King's Knight one of the highest rated shooters to have been released on the Famicom at that point. Such performance should have convinced Square that they had not only made the right choice to change their focus, but that they could also diversify their portfolio by tackling new genres. And this, combined with their roots as developers of personal computers, empowered them to continue to be creative. They made a conscious decision to create games for the Famicom and its disk system peripheral that would challenge consumer expectations, but they also wanted their games to fight against the norms that had been established by their forebearers, just as they had done with King's Knight, which catered for the fast twitch dopamine hit offered by shooters, but also introduced complicated role-playing elements. The best way they knew how to do this was to create a brand new adventure game while also overseeing the production of an innovative dungeon crawler that was being developed by a member of the Disk Original group, Hummingbird Soft. With the successful launch of Alpha, Hiromichi Tanaka had shown he had what it took to release a solid adventure game, and with the Famicom disk system offering a significant increase in storage capacity compared to the traditional ROM cartridge, replicating their success with adventure games on personal computers on the disk system would have no doubt felt like a logical choice. It was also an interesting choice, because around the time that development would have started, no adventure games had been released on the disk system, and only a few had been released on the Famicom, with the only real success being a port of Yuji Horii' The Portopia Serial Murder Case, which had managed to sell approximately 700,000 copies. This new game would be called Suishio no Dragon, or Crystal Dragon, and it would follow the adventure of Hugh and Cynthia as they dealt with the aftermath of their encounter with a crystal dragon while they were travelling through space. To help the game translate to the disk system, Tanaka oversaw the creation of an innovative user interface that resembled what had become the norm in point-and-click graphic adventure games on computers. Their partnership with Nippon Sunrise was also renewed, and an animator called Gen Sato, who would end up working on numerous Pokemon and Digimon productions, was hired to ensure the game featured cutting-edge animation. But even though they were quick to act, Square was not the only publisher to think about the potential for adventure games on the disk system, and Dead Zone, which had been created by Sunsoft, released just a few weeks before the planned release of Crystal Dragon, even innovating on the genre by featuring voice acting. This may have been frustrating, as it was direct competition. Dead Zone also reviewed well and posted strong sales, but if anything, it showed the demand for adventure games on home consoles was real. This should have all encouraged Square in the build-up to the release of their game, especially as they had worked with Nippon Sunrise to create a TV commercial, something that demonstrated the financial clout they now possessed. When Crystal Dragon launched on the 15th of December, it too was a hit, but Square couldn't take all the credit, as they benefited from an accidental guerrilla marketing campaign that had been instigated by one of the major Famicom publications. Due to the success of Famicom, numerous publications had spawned in Japan, and one of the biggest, Family Computer magazine, was concerned that their editorial efforts were being plagiarized by other publications. To test their theory, they created a fake piece of content that was rather provocative. It claimed that you could play rock, paper, scissors with Cynthia, and that if you were successful, she would start to lose her clothing. Perhaps figuring that readers would not believe such an Easter egg existed, and to make the ruse seem legitimate, Family Computer magazine even produced a doctored image from an iconic scene within the game, where they redrew Cynthia's clothes and even adjusted her hand to look like a scissor symbol instead of a paper symbol. Needless to say, it went viral, and when combined with Square's own marketing efforts, Crystal Dragon ended up selling over 500,000 copies. But even though this should have been considered a huge success for the company, the returns were diminished compared to what they could have seen by releasing the game on personal computers. The base game retailed for only 3,400 yen, and rewrites, which accounted for 30% of the game's sales, only cost consumers 500 yen. After then removing Nintendo's 30% commission, it meant the game managed to generate 818 million yen, or around $3.8 million based on exchange rates at the time. This was good as a standalone offering, but it meant Crystal Dragon had only managed to generate 300 million more yen than Will the Death Trap 2, which was Square's second ever game, despite selling 400,000 more copies and also costing a lot more to produce. Crystal Dragon was then followed up by Deep Dungeon, which was released just a week later, and the plan must have been for these two titles to act as an appetizer for Square's ambitions on the disk system, as while development had been underway on these two games, Sakaguchi and a new hire called Nasir Kabeli were hard at work on creating what the company must have hoped would end up being their killer app. Nasir Kabeli was hired, having chosen to leave the glitz and glamour of the United States of America behind to join the hustle and bustle of the Japanese video game industry. After being born in 1957 in Iran, it's believed Nasir actually fled the country during the Iranian Revolution as he was of royal blood. As a result, he migrated to the United States in 1979 in order to study computer science at the University of California, but he did poorly in classes despite being a genius programmer, as he just wasn't engaged by the curriculum. Instead, Nasir wanted to explore on his own, and after purchasing an Apple II, in just 45 days, he managed to not only teach himself the necessary programming language, but managed to create some graphic utility subroutines that made it possible to draw patterns on the screen. As Nasir's frustrations with university grew, he chose to show the subroutines he had created to Terry Bradley and Jerry Jewell, who owned a nearby computer shop called Computerland. Amongst other things, they sold home and business software, and based on what they knew about the market, they were very impressed with what Nasir had created, especially based on how little time it had taken. After some deliberation, Bradley and Jewell then made a bold decision. They chose to believe in the talents of Nasir and founded a brand new company called Sirius Software, where they hired Nasir as their lead programmer. Sirius Software started out making professional programs, but after seeing the potential for producing video games, they changed focus and never looked back. And over the next few years, Nasir made quite a name for himself within the video games industry, making millions of dollars for Sirius Software in the process. And this was because, unlike many other programmers who might take 6 months to 2 years to program a single game, Nasir was able to code much quicker, creating high-quality graphics without any diminishment in quality. This was possible because of his extreme methodologies. Nasir would never save his code as a source, it would all just be stored in his head and converted to machine code. By working this way, Nasir released 9 games in a single year, all of which made their way onto SoftTalk's Apple II's best sellers chart. But even though he had made a lot of money for Sirius and had also benefited a lot personally, Nasir felt he was owed a bigger share of the profits and left Sirius Software to create Gabelli Software. It was a huge gamble, and it was one that wouldn't pay off. Gabelli Software folded after only a year in business, and when the video game crash also reared its ugly head soon after, Nasir was burnt out. The past 3 years had just been too much, too soon. Nasir had gone from university dropout to superstar programmer to owner of his own software company, and with everything that was happening in a wider sense, instead of diving back in when his company folded, Nasir decided to retire from the video games industry completely and travel around the world, living off the money he'd earned. But after a few years, the itch to create was still there, and when Nasir decided he wanted to try and get back into the video games industry, he reached out to Doug Carlston, the founder of Broderbund, to see if there were any opportunities available. Around that time, Broderbund had been making inroads in Japan, and it just so happened that figures from Square had travelled to the United States to attend the Summer Consumer Electronics Show along with other members of the SST, as it had become increasingly important for Japanese companies. 1986 especially had a significant showing from Japanese companies, with it featuring the first appearance of Sega, where they debuted the North American version of the Master System. And it was here that Nasir was introduced to Miyamoto as well as Sakaguchi and Tanaka. After the meeting concluded, Nasir was intrigued, and following a subsequent visit to Square's headquarters in Japan, he decided to spend the next month familiarizing himself with the Famicom and the company before making any kind of commitment. When Nasir joined Square, he did so as an independent contractor as opposed to being an official employee, and his arrival was both exciting and daunting. Sakaguchi and Tanaka had been huge fans of Nasir's work on the Apple II, and when he initially visited Square's headquarters, Sakaguchi even asked him for an autograph. The acquisition of his programming talents meant they would not only be able to take their software output to the next level, as very few developers on the Famicom could produce 3D games, but on a more personal level, they would have the opportunity to work with one of their development heroes who had created innovative games like Horizon 5 and Zenith. The only challenge was that Nasir didn't understand a word of Japanese, and at the time, there were no fluent English speakers at the company. It was a significant barrier, but Miyamoto did not want to let this fantastic opportunity slip through their fingers, and Sakaguchi, the man who had risen to the occasion so many times before, was given the task of attempting to overcome what was a rather large and substantial hurdle. To take advantage of Nasir's programming talents, which would see Square be able to create games that were far more complex from a visual perspective than they ever thought possible, it was decided that it would be best to create another action game that would sit within the shooter genre. Unlike King's Knight, which was a top-down vertical shooter, this new game though would be a third-person rail shooter, as Nasir would be able to create simulated 3D sprites. But it was a risk, as even though pseudo 3D shooters were spectacular to look at, that particular subgenre was much less popular, no doubt due to the complexities that surrounded creating the games. In 1987, Atari demonstrated the potential of this subgenre with the release of Starship 1. But it wasn't until Sega released Buck Rogers' Planet of Zoom in 1982 that other developers started to take note of how crisp everything looked. The bar was again raised in 1985 when Sega released Space Harrier, and much to the chagrin of rival developers like Namco, who produced 2 Thunder Scepter games in quick succession to respond to the success of Space Harrier, it cemented Sega as the premium producer of third-person rail shooters. Due to Sega also being a rival hardware manufacturer, their games were ported to the Master System and non-competing personal computers, and this left a gap on the Famicom, as when Sakaguchi started the initial design work on this game, only 2 similar games had ever been released on the system, Genius and Sky Destroyer, and they had both been released in 1985. To try and get the best out of Nasir, Sakaguchi attempted to build a relationship, but it was challenging. They didn't have a great deal in common, and they couldn't speak the same language. Nasir also knew nobody else in Japan, so Sakaguchi felt responsible and would often take him out to dinner so that he would at least have some company. It was through these interactions that some quirks would come to light. For one, no matter what Nasir ordered in restaurants, such as spaghetti or eggs, he would always end up getting steak. Nasir also had certain expectations about Japan, based on perceptions back in the United States, such as people only ever wearing kimonos, so he would always ask why people weren't wearing them. Compared to other Japanese creatives in the same space, it made Nasir seem a bit unorthodox, but he was still a genius programmer and was intrigued by working on such different games, even if it was frustrating at times, as he deemed the Japanese way of working to be slow and very inefficient. In spite of that, the pair developed a good working relationship, and it meant that Nasir could program and realize concepts and graphics created by Sakaguchi and Kazuko Shibuya that they could only share through drawings and gestures. With development starting to make decent progress, and with internal figures no doubt hoping that thanks to the addition of Nasir's talents that this new game would become Square's first major hit, the decision was taken to try and tie in with an emerging technology in gaming, stereoscopic 3D. Throughout the early 1980s, stereoscopic 3D had been used sparingly, with games like Sub-Rock 3D requiring users to wear a special eyepiece, and Sega developing their own peripheral for the Master System called the Segascope 3D. Only a handful of games had ever utilized this technology, and the biggest in Japan was 3D Thunder Scepter 2, a special version that was released alongside the traditional version of the game. No game had ever even utilized this technology on the Famicom, but with Nasir's talents, it was possible, and it had the potential to be a game changer, as Square would be an early adopter of a technology that everyone believed would be the next big thing. Such was their confidence in this new game, which became known as Tobidase Daisakusen, or Operation Jumpout. Square had countless pairs of LCD shutter glasses manufactured, and they would be shipped alongside the game. But when the game launched, even though it managed to sell hundreds of thousands of copies, Operation Jumpout did not meet expectations, and Square were left with piles upon piles of 3D glasses, as well as countless copies of unsold games that did nothing but take up space in their warehouse and gather dust. With Square having such high hopes for Operation Jumpout, the performance would have no doubt been disappointing. But there was little time to dwell on what had happened, as new releases and new opportunities were coming thick and fast. Due to their frequent trips to the United States, senior figures at Square had fostered relationships with numerous Western publishers. The main purpose had always been about knowledge sharing and being part of something bigger, but as a consequence of their trips, Square were presented with the chance to work with David Crane, and it was an intriguing prospect. Crane had been a prolific developer on the Atari 2600 and had designed and programmed Pitfall, one of the most influential games to be released on that system. He had also designed Ghostbusters for the Commodore 64 before creating a revolutionary live simulation game called Little Computer People, where it was possible to control people and help them go about their daily lives. It was The Sims, 15 years before The Sims. Due to how unique it was, Little Computer People earned a lot of accolades, including Best Original Game at the 1985 Golden Joystick Awards, and Square entered into an agreement with Activision to bring the game to Japan, although there were quite a few changes made to make it more appealing to Japanese audiences. Despite these changes, and renaming the game to Apple Town Story, it didn't sell well upon release, and was panned by Japanese critics. And with similar fates befalling Mystery Quest and a quick sequel follow-up to Deep Dungeon, two games developed by companies that were part of the Disc Original group, there was a growing sentiment that perhaps Square had made a mistake supporting the Famicom disk system. They just couldn't sell enough copies to cover development costs and then make a substantial enough profit to help fund the next project. It forced Square to reassess their strategy, and while poor performance may not have been the only reason for the change, after the release of Deep Dungeon 2, there was a notable shift in the platforms Square chose to support and the types of games they chose to make. In truth, Square had fallen into the trap so many other publishers had done when publishing for Nintendo systems. To try and mitigate what was happening with their finances, there was a belief that if they released more games, it would make more money, and that consumers wouldn't mind if the quality of the releases was decreased if the frequency was increased. Other publishers had benefited from this approach, but they had started developing for the Famicom much earlier. By the time Square had entered the scene and were finding their feet, consumers had become wary of this approach and weren't as willing to part with their hard-earned cash for games that they knew were often substandard and rushed. Deep Dungeon 2 was the epitome of this. It was released only 6 months after the previous game, and although it received slightly better review scores, Family Computer magazine noted that there was no big difference between the first game and the second, outside of its scale. To raise some quick funds, Square also chose to follow up these games by re-releasing King's Knight on the PC-88 and X1 personal computers as King's Knight Special, and in the same month they also released Genesis, the game developed by Hiromichi Tanaka that was supposed to release at the end of 1985. Square also released a third game in the same month. This was called Aliens, Alien 2, and it was their first licensed video game that would tie in with the Hollywood movie. This had probably been sub-licensed from Activision, who were working on Aliens the computer game for Western release, but Aliens Alien 2 was an independent game and had the potential to be huge. Production was overseen by Tanaka, with Uematsu, who was credited as Kentaro Hayabusa, also involved. It was also the first game worked on by Takashi Tokita and Hiroyuki Ito. Tokita had been hired specifically for his expertise with developing graphics for games on the MSX, and he worked alongside what were dubbed the Square MSX Cancel team to create something that they would be proud of. Alongside this team, Square then outsourced development of Aliens on the PC and Famicom disk systems, but the latter version was never released. Despite working hard, the contractor they selected just couldn't produce a game for the disk system that would match the quality they expected, and due to tight deadlines, Square were forced to pull the plug. It meant that another game, which was also rushed out the door not too long after, would be their final first-party game released on the Famicom disk system. Cleopatra no Maho, a role-playing game set in Egypt, would be released only 44 days after Aliens, but it was again overseen by Tanaka, with music provided by Uematsu and graphics by Tokita. They were at least able to use the skills of Akiyoshi Sumi, who had worked on Crew Chaser Blasty on Alpha, and Miki Yukinura, who had worked with Tanaka on numerous games and also helped Uematsu get a start with the company, but it was still a ridiculous turnaround time. When the game came out, reviewers were very critical about the game's length, while praising its sound and visuals, but the more worrying trend for Square was that despite the game selling well, its financial performance was not good. Cleopatra no Maho sold 450,000 copies, something that should have classified it as a success, but because 2/3 of the sales were from rewrites, even though it had only sold 50,000 copies less than Suisho no Dragon, it had generated almost 50% less revenue. It highlighted that there needed to be a change, and that change would be witnessed with their next game, Highway Star.
Highway Star.
Unlike the previous 11 games, Highway Star would be developed as a Famicom exclusive and it would be overseen by Sakaguchi and Nasir. Even though Operation Jumpout had not performed as expected, Miyamoto insisted that Sakaguchi continue to make use of Nasir's talents with 3D graphics by creating another action game. But this time the decision was chosen to deviate away from the shooter genre and instead focus on creating a racing game. Sega had been innovators in this category, producing hit games such as Hang On and Outrun. Each had been focused towards the arcade scene and had dominated their respective release years, with Hang On being the highest grossing coin-operated arcade game throughout 1986 in the United States, and Outrun becoming Japan's highest grossing large arcade cabinet in 1987, before reportedly becoming the best-selling arcade cabinet released in that decade. Outside of its crisp pseudo 3D sprite-based graphics that were achieved by iterating on Sega's superscalar technology, Outrun also innovated by offering the player multiple routes and multiple pieces of music to listen to. There were also multiple endings, depending on the routes taken, and each one was a fully realized sequence as opposed to just a simple message of congratulations. When Sakaguchi sat down with a now extended team, which included the likes of Tokita and Shibuya, as well as other new hires like Ken Narita and Akitoshi Kawazu, the challenge posed must have been, how could they make a game that was better than Outrun? Thanks to the talents of Nasir, they knew they could rival the graphics of Outrun, and with Akita on the team supporting Nasir, they knew they would be able to add finer details through lavish environments as well as multiple vehicles. But they also realized they could push other elements further, such as introducing a slight tweak to the timer that meant, unlike in Outrun, where the game would just end when the timer ran out, players could coast and still try to hit the next checkpoint. With the addition of stereoscopic 3D functionality, which again would be supported by the use of LCD shutter glasses, no doubt as Square were trying to get rid of their surplus stock, by the end of development, Highway Star had become more than just an Outrun clone. But when it released in Japan, its sales were poor, and it wouldn't be until the game released in North America and Europe as Rad Racer that it would go on to become a huge hit, reportedly
I didn't know
selling
Square
almost 2
did
million
Rad
copies,
Racer.
being used alongside Super Mario Bros. And Tetris at the 1990 Nintendo World Championships, and earning praise as one of the greatest games to be developed on the system.
Rad Racer was
After
good.
the release of Highway Star in Japan, Square had gone to market with 11 games in just 7 months. but none of them had performed very well from a financial perspective, and the management team at Square had started to become incredibly worried about their position within the market, as well as the future of the company. In just 9 months, they had gone from obtaining their independence, moving to a high-class office location, hiring a raft of new employees, launching a new publishing label, and attempting to take advantage of the riches promised by supporting Nintendo, to all but ceasing support of the Famicom disk system and vacating their lavish office in Ginza and occupying a cheaper space in Okachimachi, which was far more known for its hustle and bustle than its ability to attract luxury brands and high-class shoppers. Their employees had also started to question their abilities as well as their futures at the company and the video games industry as a whole, and one of the most notable figures to do this was Sakaguchi. Following the lukewarm performance of King's Knight and Operation Jumpout, Sakaguchi had started to become disillusioned with life in the video game industry. There was a realization that even though the games he'd worked on were competent and functional, and many had reviewed well, they just hadn't sold enough and made enough money. They were also not the types of games he felt suited to making, nor did he really want to make them, and this feeling was compounded by Highway Star, which ultimately followed the same trend. But even before it was released, Sakaguchi realized he needed to start taking more control of his own destiny. For the longest time, he had wanted to make a role-playing game, and had scratched that itch by incorporating role-playing elements into games like Cruise Chaser Blasty and King's Knight. But his petitions to make a standalone RPG were continually rejected, as there was a belief amongst Miyamoto, as well as other senior figures at the company, that such a game would not be a financial success on the Famicom. There were also technical constraints to consider too, as there was no real saving mechanic on the Famicom, and RPGs were inherently long games. It's why they constantly pushed Sakaguchi to make action games, as they believed that's what consumers wanted. But when Dragon Quest released midway through 1986, even though its initial sales were so low that Enix feared they would end up making a loss, by the following year, the game had ended up selling over 1.5 million copies in Japan. Armed with this evidence, and feeling like he had nothing to lose, Sakaguchi again broached the subject of making an RPG, and this time the proposal was accepted. But based on his state of mind at the time, unless it ended up becoming a huge hit, Sakaguchi vowed to quit the video games industry after its completion and return to university, where, unlike Tanaka, he was still enrolled as a student after continuing to pay his tuition fees. Even though the project had been given the green light, Sakaguchi and other core members of the team were still busy working on Highway Star. Due to his track record of releasing games that underperformed, as well as his relentless work ethic, Sakaguchi had also started to gain an unsavory reputation at the company, and when he did a company-wide presentation for what he had provisionally called Fighting Fantasy, only 3 people volunteered to join his team, with everyone else choosing to work on other projects instead. Realizing it would be near impossible to make a game of this nature with only 4 people, Sakaguchi lobbied for more support, and this was how Koichi Ishii ended up being assigned to the project. But due to Highway Star not being finished, at the beginning, Ishii ended up working on the game in isolation as a project planner. This would have no doubt been quite daunting, as it was Ishii's first job within the industry, but he approached it with gusto and used the time afforded to come up with a few interesting ideas, such as the first boss also being the last boss, creating a diorama-inspired world map, and the introduction of a title card that would show after the prologue ended. Ishii also created the side view battle display that became synonymous with the franchise and genre for many years to come, and he created the initial notion of job classes, with a view to allowing the player to create their own party, as opposed to the game being focused on a single, predetermined hero or heroine. When Sakaguchi saw what Ishii had come up with, he was very impressed, encouraging him to push these ideas further, and when development on Highway Star wrapped up, and Nasir, Shibuya and Uematsu joined the team in an official capacity, everything started to come together in a more comprehensive manner.
Yay!
But it wasn't just those individuals who made significant contributions. As the project continued, and everyone else started to realize what could be achieved, the likes of Kawazu, Ito, Tokita and Narita also became involved, even though many would remain uncredited. Ito, for example, came up with the turn-based battle system used within the final product, having been inspired by professional sports such as the NFL as opposed to any prior video games or tabletop games. Shibuya also made a significant contribution, Having become the go-to person for sprite work at Square, she worked with Ishii on the look and feel of the game, designing the characters, as well as many monsters, the fonts, the menus, and even the game's opening sequence. But there was also another artist hired called Yoshitaka Amano, who worked in tandem with Ishii and Shibuya, and through the production of beautiful pieces of concept art, his work helped to elevate and influence the visual style they were implementing. Amano was born on the 26th of March 1952 in Shizuoka, a small town at the foot of Mount Fuji. From a young age, Amano became fascinated with drawing, and he would often create endless sprawling drawings and rolls of paper his brother had brought home from the paper factory where he worked. But even though his talent was obvious, Amano showed zero interest in attending formal classes and cared little about general education. He didn't want to copy other people's work or wait for the approval of teachers and peers. His main focus was just on creating. When he was just 15 years old, this drive led Amano to apply to Tatsunoko Productions, and despite his tender age, not only was Amano's application accepted, something that allowed him to drop out of school, but he was mentored by Tatsuo Yoshida, the head of the company. Within a few years, Amano had become an animation director and character designer, contributing to projects like Speed Racer, as well as Gatchaman and the Adventures of Hutch the Honeybee. But even though this was thrilling for someone who was still only a teenager, it was also incredibly draining and restricting, and this feeling was only exacerbated after Amano had been exposed to Western art styles. Despite feeling like he was being held back, Amano continued to work at Tatsunoko Productions, staying there until 1982, even after conceding that the company was no longer the same after the death of Yoshida in 1977. But throughout the decade, Amano sought outside stimulus and became obsessed with studying various art styles, many of which had a more psychedelic vibe. In this regard, he was influenced by artists such as Neil Adams and Peter Max, who would create incredible covers for comic books, as well as Frank Frazetta, the legendary artist who served as the inspiration for many comics and novels, such as the first Vampire Hunter D novel. And when Ishii learned that Sakaguchi was looking for an illustrator who could create promotional materials and illustrations, he thought Amano would be the perfect fit. But having never heard of Amano before, Sakaguchi flat out rejected the suggestion. It was only when Sakaguchi then showed Ishii some of the magazine clippings of art he wanted to replicate that the penny dropped. Amano was the artist he wanted, he just hadn't realized it. Armed with this knowledge, Amano was approached and given clear instructions. His job was not to draw pixels or program anything, it was instead to inspire and ignite the imagination. Sakaguchi wanted Amano to create artwork that would excite potential players who were looking at the box art on store shelves or reading the manual before playing the game, as there was a belief that this would make their journey into the virtual pixelated world much more exotic. But beyond that, there was also a notion of wanting Amano to support the development team, subordinating his contributions to influence what they were already working on and encourage them to dream bigger, something that helped them to make an exciting project even more exciting. There were also grand visions of how the music should sound, and even though he had worked on numerous games at Square already, many of which had been under the watchful eye of Sakaguchi, it was expected that Uematsu would work with his longtime collaborator, Toshiaki Amai, to raise their game and produce something extraordinary. Having been a promising musician himself, Sakaguchi had certain expectations for what he wanted from the musical score, and when Uematsu submitted music that he felt would be appropriate, it was rejected due to being deemed subpar. Uematsu felt this feedback was unjust, so instead of going back to the drawing board and creating a load of new material, he submitted the same songs back to Sakaguchi for review, only changing the order in which the songs would be played. Even though they were the exact same songs, Uematsu's tactic worked, and Sakaguchi approved the music immediately, later noting that Uematsu had done a real number on him. Sakaguchi also had similar interactions with Nasir, who was now programming his third game. Even though Nasir still struggled with Japanese, the pair had managed to make it work. But as they were now working on a role-playing game, there were many concepts that were more complicated and would be seen in an action-style third-person rail shooter or driving game. Nasir, for example, struggled to understand the notion of hit points or how to even program them, noting, if he's hit, why doesn't he just fall down? In the end, Sakaguchi stopped trying to explain why mechanics were necessary and just told Nessia to stop worrying about how logical they were and just program them. With the game's presentation all moving in the right direction and gameplay taken care of, the only major concern left was the scenario. And in this regard, Sakaguchi adopted an approach that he had used many years before, hiring an external party to supplement the staff. But unlike those previous hires, where Square had to find part-time writers who were just starting out in their careers, due to their enhanced reputation and finances, a professional scriptwriter called Kenji Terada was hired to bring Sakaguchi's concept to life. Terada had previously worked on numerous anime such as Tanuki-Man and Dankuga, Super Beast Machine God, and his talent was just what they needed, as the game would delve into numerous themes and concepts while merging traditional high fantasy with science fiction. As production continued, and it became clear that Sakaguchi's new project was turning into something quite special, more and more people from within Square started to become involved, with even Tanaka joining forces with Sakaguchi, something that had not really happened since they worked on their original game, The Death Trap. The development was not without its issues, and one of the biggest came with the game's name. After realizing that there was already an existing fantasy property in North America called Fighting Fantasy, the legal team relayed that they would probably need to change the game's name. This would have no doubt been frustrating, but there were at least options available. From the outset, it had been decided that they would want a short, sharp name that would be based around alliteration. It was a concept Square had used a few times before, with King's Knight, Deep Dungeon, and the Western release of Highway Star called Rad Racer. Each could be shortened to just saying the first two letters of each word, and they were keen to continue the approach, this time having the game made up of two words, both beginning with F, so that the game could be shortened to FF. They knew that one of the words needed to be fantasy, and after fighting was taken away, numerous possibilities were considered. In the end, Final Fantasy was chosen, but it was not a name that was meant to symbolize anything. They just didn't have very much time, and in their haste, they just chose the one they thought sounded the best as an alternative. As development neared its conclusion, even though many of the team were very confident that they produced something Japanese gamers would love, the business minds at Square were pessimistic, something that was to be expected given the negative trajectory the company was on. As a result, they planned to only produce 200,000 copies of the game, but Sakaguchi, perhaps because of what was at stake for him, was adamant they should produce more copies and convinced them to double their order to 400,000. Final Fantasy then launched on the 18th of December 1987 in Japan, and Sakaguchi's determination was rewarded. Significant praise was garnered from critics, and gamers across the country were keen to try the latest offering from Square, something that led to the game selling through that initial 400,000 copy shipment almost immediately. By being released on the Famicom, Square had also removed the drop in revenue they would normally see from rewrites, and they took a big risk by pricing the game at 5,900 yen. This was a hefty markup compared to many of their previous games, as well as being 400 yen more than Dragon Quest 1 and 2, and 1,000 yen more than the Famicom version of The Legend of Zelda. It meant that even though Final Fantasy wasn't a massive hit within the wider context of the Japanese video game industry, and it hadn't actually sold many more copies than other games released by Square throughout the year, it was monumental for the company from a revenue perspective. Final Fantasy made almost 2 billion yen, or the equivalent of $20 million today accounting for inflation. It was more than double their previous best return, and it changed everything. After what had been a torrid year from numerous perspectives, Final Fantasy ended up being the light at the end of the tunnel. Square had attempted to change everything they knew to chase the riches promised by Nintendo, but by entering into the market much later than their competitors, Square were forced to compete in a way that did not suit their infrastructure or talents. Values ended up being compromised, talent was mismanaged, and individuals started to question whether they were cut out for the industry. And with them being forced to leave their cushy office, it was a reality check for the leadership at Square, who had enjoyed a few years of nothing but prosperity. Your inventory is full. Final Fantasy was the reprieve, and such was its success that Square gained a newfound wave of confidence. This would lead to significant changes at the company, and those changes will provide a foundation for what would allow Square to tackle the big boys in the industry and become one of the most influential video game companies throughout the 1990s. And in the next part of this epic tale, we will explore what those changes were, as well as how Square capitalized on their diamond in the rough to build a franchise
Your inventory
and
is
create a
full.
legacy that would even be able to weather a few stumbles along the way. Before closing this video out, I'd really like to thank Crispy Crisps, who stepped in to help us create a fantastic looking and sounding second part. After being sucked into the rat race of producing shovelware for the Famicom Disk System, by the end of 1987, Square were a shadow of their former selves. They had gone from being a company on the rise, a champion who had started to establish enough clout to take on some of the biggest publishers in the Japanese video games industry, to being a company that was forced to downsize and take serious stock of their situation. Many of their employees also considered whether they were cut out for the grueling nature of the video games industry. But after the release of a game called Final Fantasy, not only did the financial performance of Square start to look a bit healthier, their reputation had been restored, and those same employees realized they had the ability to create something remarkable. In response, Square would make wholesale changes to how they operated, and in part 3 of this marvelously comprehensive documentary series about the history of Square that was created thanks to the incredible support of our Patreon community, we will focus on what happened as Square shifted to a new mentality that would promote quality over quantity. Welcome to part 3 of the complete history of Square. Not long after Final Fantasy had been released, it became quite clear to almost everyone at Square that its performance and impact within the industry was quite unlike any game they had released in the past. But that's not to say they hadn't known success. The office move to Ginza had only been possible due to the financial performance of games such as Will, The Death Trap 2 and Cruise Chaser Blasty, both of which had been released on personal computers. And even though they hadn't been as profitable, games released on the Famicom Disk System like Crystal Dragon, Operation Jumpout and Cleopatra no Mahu had managed to collectively sell over 1.4 million copies. The difference this time was that the revenue generated by Final Fantasy was almost equal to all of their first-party releases on the Famicom Disk System combined. And with this knowledge at hand, the leadership at Square oversaw a complete change in how the company would operate in order to take full advantage of the opportunity that had presented itself. From this point forward, Square would move away from their relentless pursuit of short-term gains. Instead, they would do the exact opposite, focusing on the long term by adopting an approach that favored quality over quantity. And in the immediate sense, this would see Square focus their efforts on developing just 2 projects, a far cry from their previous year, which had seen them produce 10. These projects would be given plenty of room to realize their potential, but to ensure this didn't impact the company's wider financial performance, alongside the expected revenue generated by further sales of Final Fantasy, Square would look to supplement their coffers by supporting the partners they had gained via the Disk Original Group and another initiative they'd established in late 1986 called the SCAP Trust. Hummingbird Soft, in particular, were keen to continue producing titles for the Deep Dungeon franchise, which had proved quite popular on the Famicom Disk System. With their figures combined, the first 2 games had sold over 600,000 physical copies, with an additional 450,000 sales coming via rewrites, and they worked with Square to transition the franchise over to the Famicom, with both parties no doubt hoping that Deep Dungeon 3 would replicate the success of Final Fantasy. Microcabin and System Sarcom also developed new games for the Famicom Disk System, published by Square towards the start of 1988, but with none of the 3 titles performing all that well in terms of both sales or revenue, the decision was taken midway through the year to cease external publishing operations, disband the Disk Original Group, and focus on the performance of their own initiatives, the first of which would be led by Kazuhiko Aoki. Aoki was born in Tokyo towards the end of 1961. He would end up joining Square around the same time as Hironobu Sakaguchi and Hiromichi Tanaka, but even though he fulfilled a similar role at the company, throughout 1985 and 1986, he would act as Sakaguchi's assistant, as opposed to taking the lead on any of his own projects. His first game credits would be on Cruise Chaser Blasty and King's Knight, where he helped Sakaguchi to flesh out their respective scenarios, and after impressing with his raw energy and talent, when Sakaguchi and Tanaka split off to create the A-Team and the B-Team, Aoki was given the opportunity to lead his own project as the head of the unofficial C Team. Square filed a trademark for Seiken Densetsu, The Emergence of Excalibur, in 1986, at the same time as filing trademarks for other upcoming projects such as Crystal Dragon and Deep Dungeon. And like those other two games, it would be developed for the Famicom Disk System, leading the way as part of a brand new creative initiative for the company. Development commenced towards the start of 1987, and perhaps because the shackles had been removed and it was his time to step out from the shadows, Aoki decided to shoot for the moon. Having worked in close proximity to Sakaguchi, Aoki must have been aware of the general reticence from the senior management team at Square to greenlight a role-playing game, but he decided to take a chance, opting to ask for forgiveness rather than permission. As such, Seiken Densetsu was planned to be a party-based role-playing game
Incoming
with focus
emote.
around 4 characters. It would be rooted in high fantasy, and to try and make it something unlike anything seen before, Aoki envisioned a game that would fuse together complicated and detailed design elements with a world and story that would be massive in scale. With so much planning documentation pulled together, before development even started, the publicity department at Square had started advertising the game and taking pre-orders. And to try and draw in as many potential customers as possible, alongside showcasing the visuals players might expect to see when the game shipped, and showing off many of the potential characters players could recruit to their party, the advertising campaign revealed that the game would come on a massive 5 discs, something that would have made it the largest ever game produced for the Famicom Disk System. It seemed as though everything was going well. Pre-orders started to come in and development had commenced, but after senior management took a closer look at the project and saw just how ambitious it was, as well as the proposed genre, instead of seeing how it would develop or asking Aoki to scale it back, they chose to take the drastic action of flat out cancelling the game before any significant strides were made. Later in that year, this news was broken to customers who had chosen to pre-order the game. Each would receive a small communication from Square informing them that they had 2 choices. They could either ask for a full refund or simply switch their pre-order over to Final Fantasy, a game that would end up being conceptually similar to
Your
what
skill
Aoki
has
had been
increased.
planning for Seiken Densetsu, as it was also a role-playing game that would focus on a party consisting of 4 characters. In spite of Seiken Densetsu being cancelled, the decision was taken to give Aoki another opportunity to lead. But this time, even though the game was planned to be much less grand in terms of scope, it would be no less imaginative, and Aoki's humorous disposition would be plastered all over it. Acting as an unsubtle parody of the hard-boiled hero archetype that had become prevalent within Japanese cinema at the time, Aoki decided to call the game Hanjaku Hero, which roughly translated to half-boiled hero. As such, instead of the story focusing on a hero who will be able to save the day because of their immense talent, it would focus on a prince who was ill prepared for the road ahead. And this was because his father, the king who unified the land, died suddenly, plunging the kingdom into civil war. The prince would have one advantage, however, alongside a few loyal retainers: mysterious eggs that would allow the summoning of powerful mythical beasts to aid the player in combat. But due to the satirical nature of the game, if the player failed, something that could happen even within a few minutes, then instead of everyone mourning the loss of the prince, they would instead rejoice. Aoki may have been tempted to align this whimsical scenario with another role-playing game, but instead he decided to create a real-time strategy simulation, a bold move given that the genre was still in its infancy. In mid-1982, Utopia and Cytron Masters were released as some of the first known real-time strategy games, but in Japan, the trailblazer of the genre was a game called Bokosuka Wars, which had been developed by Koji Sumi and published by ASCII Entertainment a year later in 1983. It allowed players to lead an army across a battlefield, facing off against enemies in real time while recruiting allies along the way. 5 years later, Hanjaku Hero would attempt to modernize this approach, with the player able to move the prince around the map to capture castles, fighting enemy units in real time. On top of this, they would also be able to recruit new units, replenish troop numbers, purchase special items, and receive income depending on how much territory they owned. It made Hanjaku Hero an ambitious project, especially as a few role-playing elements were layered over the top, and to ensure everything delivered on expectations, Not only would Aoki work with longtime development collaborator Vids Laboratory, who had worked on both the MSX ports of Thexter and King's Knight, he would also be given access to some of Square's top creative talent. This would see Nobuo Uematsu assigned to add flair via the game's soundtrack, and Takashi Tokita work with Hiromi Nakada and Masanori Hoshino on the game's visuals, which included numerous monster designs associated with the mysterious eggs mechanic. With everything coming together, Square turned their attentions to promotion. Keen to replicate the approach they had taken with Final Fantasy, Square approached an artist called Katsutoshi Fujioka. They had been producing stylized covers for magazines such as Technopolis, and were brought on board to fulfill a similar role to Yoshitaka Amano. Fujioka would produce character designs alongside Masaya Imamura and Yuichi Furuno, many of which would appear within the instruction manual, with the objective of inspiring the sprite artists and exciting the imagination of players who had purchased the game. But the main area of focus was creating a stunning piece of artwork for the game box, used to draw in potential players and encourage them to check out what was in reality a very forward-thinking and innovative video game. Anjaku Hero would end up releasing on the 2nd of December 1988, almost a year after Final Fantasy, and outside of it being considered one of the first real-time strategy games targeted at home consoles released in that region, it showed just how much Square had changed their approach to development. They had published a few games throughout the year, but unlike in 1987, where they had developed and released almost 10 different games, as well as publishing games developed by their partners, throughout 1988, focus had been on the creation of just 2 games, Anjaku Hero and a follow-up to their breakout title called Final Fantasy II. Prior to the release of Final Fantasy, Square had seldom been in a position to consider creating follow-ups to any of their existing properties. They just hadn't performed well enough. And because they had cycled through so many different games and so many different genres, there must have been no real belief that they would strike gold, which meant they had never planned for what they should do should such an event happen. Part of the reason that Hironobu Sakaguchi had implored the company to double their initial shipment of Final Fantasy was around fulfilling that objective. Even though he had vowed to quit the industry should the game fail to live up to expectations, Sakaguchi felt it would be better to go down swinging than to bow out with a whimper, and he knew that if they could sell around 400,000 copies, it would open up possibilities. When Final Fantasy sold through that initial shipment and went further, exceeding 500,000 copies sold, it became clear that they now had a foundation that they had been craving. But instead of continuing with their previous approach, which would have seen Square greenlight a quick and cheap follow-up to take advantage of the game's popularity, the opposite happened. Outside of Katsuhiko Aoki and the small team that had been assigned to assist Vids Laboratory with the development of Anjaku Hero, almost everyone else at the company was assigned to work on Final Fantasy II, with some individuals such as Masanori Hoshino even ending up working on both games. Square also chose to be methodical, affording a much longer development cycle, and to ensure Final Fantasy II wouldn't just equal the performance of its predecessor, but would surpass it, Sakaguchi was given the official designation of Director, as alongside retaining staff, Square would bring on board new hires, and he would be responsible for managing a group that was almost double in size. Empowered, Sakaguchi and the team decided to take an unorthodox approach. As there had never been any plans for a sequel, and the original game was self-contained, instead of iterating, they would take the original game, put it to one side, and make something completely different. To say that this was a risk would be an understatement. Square had struck gold, but the proposition was that even though they should still utilize the Final Fantasy name, they should not exploit their success by having the follow-up be too iterative. And this approach would fly in the face of years and years of evidence that suggested fans wanted the exact opposite. Movies have been creating sequels for decades, and they almost always promised more of the same, just bigger and better. Even though video games were fledgling by comparison, in Japan, companies have been taking similar approaches. Dragon Quest II, for example, made numerous gameplay enhancements, but the plot was still set within the same world, taking place 100 years in the future and focusing on a descendant of the main protagonist. Super Mario Bros. 2, also known as the Lost Levels, took a similar approach, as it featured the same cast of characters and very similar mechanics to the original game, albeit with an increased difficulty threshold. But Final Fantasy II would have no mention of chaos and the Four Fiends. The nameless band of Warriors of Light were replaced by protagonists with actual names and proper backstories, and the kingdoms and peoples, such as Cornelia and the Lufanians, disappeared from the wider lore. Early drafts of the story, which were pulled together towards the start of 1988, would instead revolve around a political scandal, which saw three brothers fighting to succeed their father as the King of Altair. But just a few months later, wholesale changes would be made. Each new draft would feature many of the same characters as the original outline, such as Leon, Hilda, and Firion, but their roles would be changed to work in with an ever-evolving script. In the end, it was decided that Firion would become the main character, and alongside Leon, Maria, and Guy, he would set out on a quest to defeat an evil empire that had formed during their childhood. And after the wider concepts had been laid out, they would again be refined by Kenji Tarada. With the narrative undergoing wholesale changes, Akitoshi Kawazu and the rest of the game designers adopted a similar approach when developing the gameplay. It would see the typical and expected leveling system that would revolve around the acquisition of experience points and predetermined stat increases upon leveling up tossed aside. This would be replaced by a more fluid and ambitious system that was based around world memory, with the objective being that actions taken within each battle would have an impact on character development. It would see players who used axes see their proficiency with axes increase over time, allowing them to deal more damage using the same weapon as another character with low proficiency. Likewise, characters who took a lot of damage but survived would gain health, working in with the adage of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. By incorporating such a dynamic system, Kawazu believed that not only would it adapt to the whims of the player, it would allow for so much more diversity
You've been
in terms of
examined.
character development than the original system could have ever hoped for. And that was because, instead of being restricted to one job or role, players could make multi-purpose characters who could be hybrids, able to tank and serve as both powerful magic and physical damage dealers. On top of this, an innovative dialogue system was developed that would place more emphasis on NPCs. Unlike the original game, where NPCs would have set dialogue, in Final Fantasy II, players would be able to talk to NPCs about specific keywords or phrases, and this would allow players to learn more about the wider world as well as progressing the plot. Many other systems were also considered, such as integrating the passing of time and some form of morality meter that would have an impact on how the story progressed. But many of these features would end up being cut, as despite being afforded much more time for development, there were some unexpected side effects. Perhaps the most extreme was that their main programmer, Nasir, could only get a work visa that lasted for a finite amount of time, and when the visa expired, due to how integral Nasir was for the entire game, and there being no feasible way of him being able to work remote from the US, it's reported that 6 members of the Japanese development team, as well as all of the equipment and materials they needed, were instead transported over to Sacramento in the United States so that they could finish production alongside Nasir. As development wound down, Final Fantasy II would end up being by far the most expensive game ever produced by Square. Raw development costs would end up being around 75 million yen, or approximately $600,000 at the time. That was only the beginning, as to ensure Final Fantasy II was a successful follow-up, Square spent big on promotion. There was a realization that even though Final Fantasy had been a hit, many other publishers were still well ahead of Square. Even within their own genre, Dragon Quest had gone from selling 1.5 million copies with its first installment in 1986 to selling 3.8 million with its third installment, which had been released at the start of 1988. This had been done by creating high-quality games, rammed full of intriguing gameplay mechanics and compelling stories. But there was also a realization that companies like Enix were doing everything they could to maximize interest. And
Your
they were doing
skill
such
has
a good
increased.
job that led to an occurrence of events such as the infamous truancy spree, which resulted in almost 300 students being arrested because they were so desperate to play Dragon Quest III upon its release. Taking note, Square decided to try and replicate their success, and alongside appearing on Japanese TV shows and producing TV advertisements, they decided to take the production of merchandise more seriously. On the 17th of December 1988, this led to Square opening an official store in Tokyo's bustling Shibuya ward, the exact same day that Final Fantasy II was released. Inside, fans will be able to purchase merchandise relating to the original Final Fantasy as well as its sequel. What was on offer ranged from traditional items such as t-shirts, posters and pencil cases through to other items such as video game soundtracks, which have become quite trendy. But that hadn't been the case for very long.
Your skill has increased.
Throughout the mid-1980s, Video game soundtracks
Yeah, level 26.
Pac-Man Fever would serve as an odd exception, with Fever being an apt word to describe its outlandish and unexpected commercial success. But in Japan, the production of soundtracks was a very niche industry, with albums like Video Game Music and its sequel, The Return of Video Game Music, which contained a collection of pieces of music from Xevious, Pac-Man and Galaga, serving as limited examples. It wouldn't be until 1986 that publishers would start to understand the potential of the medium. On the 31st of March 1986, Nintendo released
Be right back, Bio.
Super Mario Bros. Original soundtrack on cassette and vinyl. And what made it quite special is that alongside the main overworld theme as it appeared in-game, the album also included an orchestrated version of the same theme. Not long after, Square became one of the first publishers to follow suit, releasing soundtracks for Cruise Chaser Blasty and Alpha, and by the end of the year, other publishers such as Konami, Hudson, Tecmo and Capcom had teamed up with the Warner Pioneer record label to release soundtracks relating to their games. The release that truly stoked the imagination though was the Dragon Quest Suite. This was released on the 5th of October 1986, and it featured arrangements of 8 of Koichi Sugiyama's tracks performed by the Tokyo Strings Ensemble. This was followed up in February 1987 by the Dragon Quest II Suite, and it must have been not only inspiring for the many other video game composers who were working in Japan around the same time, but also intriguing for publishers. It wouldn't take too long for that intrigue to be acted upon, as an orchestrated version of the soundtrack of Xanadu 2 was released only 5 months later. But even though Final Fantasy had been a huge success, and its music had been very well received, Square decided to hold off releasing any kind of soundtrack related to Final Fantasy throughout 1988, opting to instead wait until Final Fantasy II had been released. By this point, it wouldn't be uncommon for there to be well over 10 video game related music releases happening every month, and to highlight just how popular they had become, there were even 7 other video game soundtracks released on the same day that Square and Polystar released their Final Fantasy I and II combined soundtrack. What was known as All Sounds of Final Fantasy I and II was released on CD and cassette. It would allow players to hear music from the original 2 games in their original 8-bit format whenever they pleased, but anyone who purchased the album would also be treated to some unused pieces of music, and what could well have been the first official arrangement of a piece of Final Fantasy music. Unlike the other tracks, Farewell FF World, which was arranged by a musician called Michiaki Kato, would feature modern instrumentation. But the most appealing part of the track was that it would serve as a huge medley, combining pieces from Final Fantasy I and II into a long, blended experience that was perfect for those who had fallen in love with Uematsu's work over the 2 games. All Sounds of Final Fantasy I and II retailed for 2,348 yen, or just under $20. And after selling over 12,500 copies, it would end up reaching number 67 on the Oricon charts, generating hundreds of thousands of dollars for Square. But beyond that, it showed Square that there was a real appetite within the fanbase for products that would enrich, enhance, and extend enjoyment beyond just the games themselves, and that these additional products could be used to supplement the revenue generated by direct game sales. To work along with this new line of thinking, behind the scenes, Nobuo Uematsu, no doubt having been aware of the success of the Dragon Quest suites, had been working hard to see his music receive the same treatment. By his own words, Uematsu would end up begging renowned classical composers Katsuhisa Hattori and his son Takayuki to assist, and after they relented, work would start on the Final Fantasy Symphonic Suite. All of this served to show that Final Fantasy was moving in the right direction as a brand, and when sales figures started to come in for Final Fantasy II, the evidence wasn't just circumstantial. Even though wholesale changes had been made to the game, and the development team had not only almost doubled in size, but were required to work for periods outside of the country, Final Fantasy II would go on to sell around 800,000 copies on the Famicom, generating over 3 billion yen. With raw development and marketing costs coming in at around 150 million yen, this was an incredible profit, equal to around 24 million US dollars at the time, or almost $60 million today when adjusting for inflation. And even though it was still way short of the most recent Dragon Quest installment and many of Nintendo's premium properties, the sales figures represented an increase of over 50% in comparison to the original game, and it showed that their decision to focus on quality over quantity had been a good one, and its performance encouraged Square to continue on the same path. 1989 would therefore be focused on producing just 2 games for the Famicom, But although there was a clear division of responsibilities between Square's A and B teams, due to the different scale of each initiative, there was clear crossover. Primary focus would be placed on the development of a third Final Fantasy game. It would be helmed by Sakaguchi, and development would be handled by Square's A team. Secondary focus would then be placed on the development of a smaller project based around the adventures of Tom Sawyer. It would be helmed by Hiromichi Tanaka, with development handled by Square's B team. But due to its scale, even though some staff worked on this game in isolation, many, such as Hiroyuki Ito and Takashi Tokida, also worked on Final Fantasy III. These two projects were planned to be the nucleus of Square's activities throughout the year, but Masafumi Miyamoto decided to use Square's newfound capital to explore some calculated ventures, and the first was Square's expansion into North America. Armed with a capital investment of $500,000, Squaresoft Incorporated was established in March of 1989 as a wholly owned subsidiary. Square had dipped their toes into this market before, but they had never taken the primary risk. Like some other smaller Japanese publishers, this risk was deferred to specialists who would attempt to localize only their biggest properties. In the case of Square, the North American release of Operation Jumpout will be handled by Acclaim, a new publisher founded by 3 former Activision employees. They would rename it to the 3D Battles of World Runner.
Okay, I'm sorry, Dave. I had paused to eat dinner. You're asking me if is mining is four pieces. It's same as this. It's body, gloves, pants, feet. Body, gloves, pants, feet.
But returns were modest. The next property would be Highway Star, but instead of using Acclaim or a similar North American publisher, Square decided to go through Nintendo, preferring to then align with Mattel for its release in Europe. It would be renamed Rad Racer, and it resonated with international audiences, forming significant.
They might not be for sale
than it had done in Japan. This led to Rad Racer selling well over 1 million.
I don't know.
And it became a favorite for Nintendo whenever they wanted to showcase their system. Final Fantasy would have been the next logical subject for localization based on how well it had performed in Japan.
If they're not a sale, they'll be at the bottom of the list.
A significant stumbling block, as in comparison to other more arcade-centric titles, there was huge amounts of dialogue that would need to be translated. Based on this, another property was selected. King's Knight was the first major game developed by Square after they shifted focus away from developing games for personal computers. But outside of it being representative of Square trying out new ideas as they attempted to cater to different audiences, it also represented a shift in release strategy. In their earlier days, Square often produced each individual game for multiple systems, and this was accomplished by either using internal resources, hiring freelancers, or contracting another development studio. But once they shifted over to developing for Nintendo platforms, games were subsequently only released on one system, either the Famicom or the Famicom Disk System. But there was one exception, King's Knight. A few months after its initial release on the Famicom, King's Knight would be ported over to the MSX, and the following year it will be re-released as King's Knight Special on the PC-88 and X1. 2 years later, it was then selected by Squaresoft to be the first game they published in North America, and although it would only be received by moderate fanfare upon its release, as shown by Nintendo Power awarding it a 65 out of 100, the game had still been put to market within just 6 months of the subsidiary being established, and amongst other things, such as reworking the game's title screen, they had created a new logo, new box packaging, and even cleaned up the English wording that featured during the ending. With a successful release under its belt, signalling what Square no doubt hoped would be a bright future for their North American division, the Japanese side of the business would also embark on a similar quest into the unknown. Miyamoto knew that the key to Square's success would be to grow when they had the opportunity to do so. And although the revenue generated by Final Fantasy made them feel comfortable about establishing a presence in North America, beyond that, there was also a feeling that Final Fantasy should be exploited, but not relied upon. It's why, in conjunction with the North American release of King's Knight, an MSX2 port of Final Fantasy was commissioned for release in Japan. Development would be overseen by a small 5-person team at Microcabin who had been part of the Disc Original group, and they were encouraged to alter the game in order to take advantage of the features offered by the MSX2. This saw the colour palette expanded, adding more vibrancy to character and enemy sprites and background graphics, the option to have unlimited saves through the use of blank floppy disks, and upgraded music and sound effects. Work also started on a North American localization of Final Fantasy, although this would be handled by Nintendo as opposed to Squaresoft. But perhaps their riskiest venture was not even remotely part of their initial planning, and that was the development of a brand new game for Nintendo's latest console, the Game Boy. Always looking to move forward, Gunpei Yokoi envisioned a new way for people to play games. It would serve as a fusion of the Game & Watch and the Famicom, allowing players to not just game on the go, but by using cartridges, giving them a choice over the game that they wanted to play. Armed with Super Mario Land and a few other first-party games such as Alleyway and Baseball, when the Game Boy launched on the 21st of April 1989, it was an immediate hit in Japan. Within the first 2 weeks of its release, 300,000 units had been sold, and with there being no signs of things slowing down, instead of waiting around like they had done with the Famicom, only entering the market once other publishers had established themselves, Miyamoto decided that Square should be proactive. Development on Square's Game Boy game will commence around the middle of 1989, and as resources had already been committed to the 2 other projects, in order to now develop on 3 fronts, existing senior resources would need to be reassigned and fresh faces would need to be hired. Perhaps the most high-profile staff member to be affected by this was Akitoshi Kawazu, who had been fundamental to the success of Final Fantasy 1 and 2. Kawazu was born on the 5th of November 1962 in the small town of Oguni, which was situated about 50 kilometers north of Mount Aso, Japan's largest active volcano. It was a small, rural town, but despite being surrounded by nature, Kawazu, by his own admission, was not the most athletic of children. In spite of this, Kawazu chose to ignore his own shortcomings, and even though other people would never consider him as such, he would often project himself as the hero of any situation, seeking the limelight at every opportunity, and even standing up to his superiors when he deemed it appropriate. For education, Kawazu attended Kumamoto Prefectural High School, a prestigious school in the area. By the time Kawazu was in attendance, it had already produced numerous alumni that had gone on to make a big impact on Japan, and other students studying around the same time as Kawazu would include the likes of Toshio Miike, who would work on TV and film franchises such as Godzilla, Ultraman and Kill Bill, and Keiko Honda, who would become the first woman in Asia to become a senior partner at McKinsey & Company. While studying here, Kawazu would gain exposure to science fiction, and he developed a particular fascination with 2 properties in particular, Star Wars and Star Trek. And it would be through the latter franchise that Kawazu would be introduced to video games, as he learned about a new Star Trek game that was releasing on the Apple II and was intrigued. This acted as the gateway, and while studying at university, having secured a place at the science school at the elusive and illustrious Tokyo Institute of Technology, Kawazu fell in love with video games like Ultima 4, as well as the wider concept of tabletop gaming. Having then studied numerous games and subsequently boiled down their design to a fundamental level, Kawazu dreamt of being able to one day create similar experiences of his own, but such jobs were in short supply and were not deemed sensible career choices. With graduation looming, Kawazu instead managed to secure a position at Sony, but due to some unfortunate circumstances, he was unable to accept the position, and he ended up bouncing around a few part-time positions before landing a job at a magazine called Beep, where he wrote reviews about the latest video games. As this wasn't secure work, Kawazu continued to look for alternative sources of employment, but after managing to land a position at a software company, instead of accepting, he explored alternatives. He decided to look around more, that should a similar position exist at a video game company, he would be a strong candidate. It just so happened that Square were looking to hire at the time, and having been familiar with the company after seeing their games while working at Beep, he decided to apply. Kawazu joined Square having expected to work on Crystal Dragon, a project being helmed by Hiromichi Tanaka, but instead he was left largely to his own devices and given limited guidance. To keep busy, he started writing proposals for games he wanted to produce. But before making any significant progress, he was assigned to Sakaguchi's team to work on Highway Star and then Final Fantasy. It was here that Kawazu's strengths would come to the fore, as Sakaguchi put his years of dissecting tabletop and video game mechanics to good use. We would see him work alongside Koichi Ishii and Hiroyuki Ito to design many of the gameplay systems featured in Final Fantasy 1 and 2. But even though he was a prominent member of the team, when the prospect of making a brand new game for the Game Boy presented itself, Kawazu moved away and was joined by Ishii. The hope must have been that since the two were so integral to the establishment of Final Fantasy, they should be able to come up with something just as compelling on the Game Boy, and their confidence was shown almost as soon as the project had started. After seeing the popularity of Tetris, which had taken Japan by storm, Miyamoto requested that Kawazu make a similar puzzle-based experience. This would have seen Square revert back to their olden days of chasing trends, irrespective of their own experiences and interests, so Kawazu ignored Miyamoto, deciding to make a role-playing game instead, as it played to their strengths. By making this decision, it meant that they could spend most of their time figuring out how they could adapt the genre they knew so well to a new and unknown device that came with not just hardware restrictions, but also new expectations from the player. As a way of differentiation, Kawazu and Ishii decided that even though certain elements would be similar, the game should not attempt to simply replicate Final Fantasy. For this reason, the story was changed to revolve around climbing a high tower to defeat a god, as opposed to saving the world. They introduced the ability to manifest as different types of monsters, which was inspired by an old game called Hack, and to create a new kind of vibe, they moved away from the Final Fantasy name, instead coming up with Saga, as it was much shorter and simpler. As Saga started to take shape, and the fundamental game design and graphical elements had been established, the main objective then became how they could make the game completable within 6 to 8 hours. Not only would this be mindful of battery life, it was also the average length of a flight from Tokyo's Narita Airport to Hawaii. But beyond that, they also wanted Saga to cater for people playing in short bursts, and made modifications such as increasing encounter rates so that players would always leave each session feeling satisfied. By taking all of these elements into consideration, within a relatively short period of time, Kawazu, Ishii and the extended team had managed to make a compelling experience. And as it launched as not just only the 18th game available to Game Boy consumers in Japan at the time, but also the first role-playing game on the system, consumers couldn't get enough. It's unclear what Square's expectations would have been in the build-up, but when Saga launched on the 18th of December 1989, even though its revenue was modest due to it selling at a much lower price point of 3,500 yen, it set a new benchmark for the company by being the first game produced by Square to sell over 1 million copies. The surprising success of Saga created an interesting dilemma for Square. What was meant to be a quick release designed to latch onto an emerging trend ended up generating more revenue than the original Final Fantasy, and such was the quality of the product, with Famitsu scoring it as a 35 out of 40, the same score that Final Fantasy II had received. It showed that the existing talent at Square, as well as those they had hired to help out, were capable of producing experiences that iterated on their newly established foundations without being too derivative. This would lead to a split within Square, as while Sakaguchi toiled away on Final Fantasy III, Kawazu was encouraged to follow his own path, and in the preceding years, this decision would pay dividends, with Square consolidating their position as a market-leading developer and publisher in the Japanese video games industry. In the next part of this ever-evolving tale, we will explore how Sakaguchi, Kawazu, and even Ishii would work to continue expanding the reach of Square as they sought to bring Final Fantasy Saga and an original franchise to new audiences, and how the company attempted to deal with this continued success, navigating through rapid expansion on multiple fronts. Before closing out this video, I would like to offer a sincere apology about how long it's been between parts 2 and 3. When we started the project, the scope was planned to be much smaller, but after working on the initial draft, it felt as though we would be doing a disservice to the many people who have contributed to the success of this amazing franchise and company, so we decided to expand everything, and focused as much as we could on the smaller details and individuals who have helped to shape the history of Square. From your feedback, it's clear that this was a good decision, but the knock-on effect was that due to how much the scope was expanded, it became quite overwhelming. There were just so many pieces of the larger puzzle that needed to be slotted into place in order to tell a flowing and compelling. The creation of a vast and intriguing world is often central to the success of any fantasy-based property, and if it's done in the correct manner, said world can enrich the entire experience, empowering audiences to kickstart their imaginations. One of the fundamental elements is the establishment of rules and regulations that help audiences to understand the kind of world they've been invited to, and on top are layered the various regions, the kingdoms that reside within them, and perhaps most importantly, who the power players are. To evidence this, if you think about some of the most popular fantasy-based entertainment properties, such as Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, Warcraft, and The Elder Scrolls, the worlds, with their various races, kingdoms and factions, and power players, have played an important role in establishing what readers, watchers, and players might expect to see as the story evolves. In the early days of the Final Fantasy franchise, due to hardware limitations and the infancy of the genre, this aspect was often difficult to establish. Effort was made to build each world, with numerous towns and dungeons scattered throughout, and individuals of importance would also be created. But each of these elements were often quite limited in scope, relegated to being narrative devices as opposed to crucial parts of an expansive lore. On top of this, unlike the aforementioned fantasy-based properties, the scenario writers decided to focus on making sure that humanity was often placed at peace with itself. Conflict would instead be the result of nefarious dark forces that were not a central part of the established world, and it would be down to the humans to be the bastions of all that was good, tasked with driving away whatever evil monster had sought fit to try and bring harm to its citizens. Final Fantasy VI was the first game that attempted to challenge these notions in a meaningful way. But despite having an overarching evil...
I hate to do this, guys, but I had a really long day, and I'm very tired, and I'm just going to give in to that. I'm not going to fight it, because I don't believe I'm providing good content. I'm sorry. Just, I had a lot to do today. I had a doctor's appointment, shopping, and all this other stuff. Had to move like hundreds of pounds of liquid and stuff, and I'm just, I'm not really... not doing too good. I think I'm just going to go to bed, low blood sugar, and I'm just kind of tired, and yeah, yeah. I mean, normally I would stay up late, but also today's tomorrow's kind of like a different day. Oh, pretty good. Yeah, I'll tell you about it tomorrow, Dave, but I'm going to go to bed. I'm sorry. But thank you guys, and thank you so much for the support. And I'll catch you guys around.